So you gotta start this one off with an apology, and that is for the video, because you're gonna see the trailer, and then you're gonna see a little bit of gameplay, and it's gonna kind of go back and forth. One of the big issues with this type of game is that there's not a lot of action, so you kind of gotta take what you can get, So anyway, the type of game we're talking about, obviously because you clicked on the thumbnail, is Pentiment. This game was a Microsoft exclusive for almost a year or so, I believe. It is made by Obsidian. It looks like an indie game, but it's not. It relies heavily on dialogue and your choices. But before we get into this game at all, I wanted to let you guys know that for the price of 2 clicks, yes, only 2 clicks, you could be saving 2 buttons, likey and subber, right down at the bottom. They're innocent little buttons that never get clicked, and unfortunately, they go away if we don't do our part. So be a good person and click those buttons. Anyway, on to Pentiment. So, as I said, this is one of those Xbox games that came over recently, and it was rumored to be with a bunch of other games, and it really was the only one that showed up. And I feel like it's kind of the, neglected stepchild of those games. Many people were much more excited for like Hi-Fi Rush and Sea of Thieves, but we ended up getting Pentiment. Now, let me just say this. Pentiment is a really fun game, and it speaks volumes to it because I'm not one of those people who loves the interactive novel. I don't like reading because I'm dumb and it's still difficult for me, but also just because it gets boring sometimes, right? Like these long stretches of just dialogue that go on forever, you kind of start zoning out, forgetting what was even said before. Well, this game doesn't do that, and I do appreciate that. I'm not going to get too much into the story. All I'm going to say, though, is they give it to you in short little bursts, and then you got to go meet another NPC or someone else in the community or someone from the church, and you kind of push the story on that way just by talking to other people. Now, some big events happen in this game that has you doing things like playing detective, being a mediator, and also, of course, just being an everyday go-between, because, that's what happens in most of the games. We are nothing more than glorified messengers. But all of that stuff happens, and your choice actually really does matter. In fact, one thing I noticed on the second playthrough, that it's really easy to miss a lot of different events and relationships and just a lot of different things that happen, dialogue, information, just by not optionally going off and talking to people. See, one of the things that this game sort of gets you on is you're sort of on a schedule, and it is incredibly passive, but my first playthrough, I didn't know that. And in this game, you play as Andreas. You're sort of working for the church, and yet at the same time working on your masterpiece. And you do have a scheduled time when it says you have to be working, and it always seems like they're kind of checking up on you. And so I was always like afraid, like, oh, I'm going to get in trouble if I'm not working or if I'm not eating with people I should be. And then my second playthrough, I didn't care and realized just how many opportunities you had during those times to go experience different things, unlock different events, and like I said, have different relationships. Now, I will say one thing I liked about this game, though, was it's one of the few games that, aside from the events that happen in the game, which are really interesting and really engaging, they also tell a story that we don't get to hear very often. And that is, in this time frame when the church was like the leader in science and culture and art, medicine, education, like all this stuff, we kind of forget like that was a thing, and most of the people and townspeople, they were still kind of relating to the old ways, the paganism, and just that environment itself, I just found really interesting. And I really appreciated that the game did that. And even though this game isn't based off a true story, I do know that happened. It's just from my experience, I completely forget what the church's role was in a lot of ways and why it is where it is. And the idea that was going on back then, like how a lot of great scientists actually worked for the church and, how people were very resistant to becoming Christian. And so I did find that interesting. Like, it was pretty cool. Not to mention, though, that does play a role in the game because the fact that money becomes an issue for the church itself. And again, I'm not going to get into how all that works out, but you're constantly trying to make moral decisions. Even sometimes when you don't realize that they are incredibly important decisions, and you take a step back and you look at the fallout of your choices or your actions, and you're like, oh, I screwed up. Or, oh, it's a good thing I did that. It's one of those games, though, and it does beg to be replayed. Like, I think that that's where you're going to get the value of this game. Now, I want to go on to graphics and just the aesthetics. One of the things that I've noticed people kind of complaining about is the aesthetics. It does have like this medieval kind of indie game look to it, but that's completely done on purpose, by the way, because much of this game is actually about literature and art and scribes. And so the game itself sort of takes on that look of being from a book. It's reading Rainbow. But seriously, the aspect of your character and other characters being immersed in this art, like literally immersed in the art and telling the story of the artwork itself, I think it's like another really cool idea and wouldn't really play off as well if the aesthetics didn't look the way they did. Be it that your characters do look like they're a book from that time, or that they belong in a book from that time, it really plays off of itself. Not to mention the fact that I think it was a smart move, just in general, because graphically it looks really good. And even though, the things like frame rate don't really matter in a game like this, it is still probably a lot easier to maintain a locked frame rate. And speaking of frame rate and performance and all of that good stuff, never had a single issue on the Switch, never had a crash, never felt laggy, never any sort of issues. The only thing that I would slightly complain about, and I need to start complaining more about, is load times. There's quite a bit of a load time that first, time you boot up the game. And, it's something I don't bring up enough, but I do definitely need to. I'm just kind of used to it being a Switch user. Also, sound. I didn't love it. It was fine. Like, it just for me felt a little mediocre. And honestly, I'm not trying to be overly critical or too harsh. It's just something that I felt maybe could have had a little bit more depth, as well as like voice acting. Some of those things I would have liked to see more of, or more depth to those things, but it is fine, honestly, because since the game did have this visual aesthetic of being a book, that sort of made sense too. That the sound and audio wasn't, top notch. In fact, in some weird way, I think that actually worked. But I will say another thing that I want to talk about more often when I'm reviewing games is, should you get this game now or should you wait for a sale? That's something that I definitely want to touch on with more games. And with Pentiment, I think it's honestly worth it to buy it at full price, especially if you're interested in the game itself. But it is about 15 to 20 hours. Obviously, the first run will probably take you longer than the second or third, but there's a good, maybe even 100 hours of gameplay here if you want to really go through multiple times or unlock different things, just find out how your actions actually change things. Honestly, I'm being very generous with 100 hours, but maybe even 50 hours. But for $20 and for a really good game and a very well-written game, I think that's worth it. But if you're one of those people who maybe doesn't always like this style of game, doesn't like the interactive novel type games, then maybe wait for a sale. But that's just my thoughts on it. Now, ultimately, if I was going to give it a final score, Obsidian makes good games, and this is one of them. I would give it a 7.5 out of 10. It's a really good game, and it's definitely worth your time. Anyway, guys, let me know what your thoughts are on Pentiment. Is this one of those games you've been looking at, you've been thinking about, interested in, or something you've never heard of? Anything and everything down in the comment section below would be really appreciated. Also, if you want a few extra gold coins for the Nintendo eShop, in the comment section below, please put whatever game you're excited to play, like something new or something that's coming out soon that you're really looking forward to, and that'll enter you in for a chance to win a $10 Nintendo eShop card. Anyway, guys, I appreciate each and every one of you. Love y'all. Bye-bye.